Before we get started with this episode, I have a few requests. Download the Talk Music Talk app. It is free for iPhone and Android, wherever you get your apps, or you can subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. Once you do, just leave a rating and or review in the store to help spread the word about the podcast. Second, share this episode on social media if you enjoy it. Facebook, Twitter, however you like to do it. It will help spread the word about the podcast. And finally, I am in the process of acquiring advertisers and sponsors, and I need your help. Just take a quick survey on my website at talkmusictalk.com/survey. Should take you 30 seconds or less, and it would be greatly appreciated. And now for today's show. Hey, welcome to another episode of Talk Music Talk with Boice. I am Boice. This is my podcast. Thank you for listening. Talk Music Talk is a weekly music interview podcast where I have long-form discussions with people who are connected to music from different genres and backgrounds, from musicians and singers and songwriters, music therapists, music journalists, and on this very special episode, well, two special episodes. It is my birthday week, November 30th to be precise, depending when you are listening to this episode. I'm celebrating with two companion episodes released simultaneously. First time I've ever done that. Not only for my birthday, but also because 2 years ago, I started Talk Music Talk in November, about a week ago. So why not celebrate with two great shows? The theme of both shows is LCD Soundsystem, LCD theme, episode 107, which you are listening to right now, and 108, which I will tell you about shortly. This episode, 107, is with Ryan Leas. Ryan is a music journalist. He's a contributing editor for Stereo Gum, and he is also the author of a book on LCD Soundsystem, Sound of Silver, the 116th volume in the 33 and a third series of books. We talk about the book, of course, his writing of the book. We also talk about his first discovering Sound of Silver, what the album means to him. And we also talk about his path to becoming a journalist from the beginning to current, all up to date, everything about him you'll want to know. In 2011, James Murphy, who is the frontman of LCD Soundsystem, in case you didn't know, disbanded the project in 2011. That's right, with a series of farewell shows, and have recently reunited the group in 2016 with more shows. A new album is in the works. You're going to get to hear Ryan's thoughts on the farewell, the reunion, all that good stuff. And now, what a segue for episode 108. Episode 108 is with Gavin Russum. He plays synths in LCD Soundsystem, also builds instruments for them. It is a 90-minute plus conversation about his life, career, being in LCD, his own projects like Black Meteoric Star. You're going to hear a track from his DJ set featuring Black Meteoric Star, a track from them. That's episode 108. I can't think of a better reason to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss it. But without further ado, here it is, my conversation with Ryan Leas on Talk Music Talk. Enjoy. I was having dinner with a friend this weekend, and he was asking me like what my next interview was. I was telling him it was you. And his question was, an entire book? I'm like, yeah, there's like a whole series of them. So how do you know you have an entire book to fill for one album?
On Sound of Silver?
Yeah.
Because they asked me to fill an entire book on it. I don't know. Ironically enough, before Bloomsbury approached me about doing it earlier this year, that had been the one I wanted to pitch during the last open call. And I hadn't gotten around to it, or, had been on tour or something like that. And originally, the chapter that is called New York, I Love You, But You're Bringing Me Down, the one that's about the New York rock album over the years a little bit, that was kind of a broader thesis. And I wanted to sort of do a whole 33 and a third about Sound of Silver, but kind of with this overarching argument. And that kind of became evident that there wasn't the time or resources to do it that way within the context that they had given me. So then, but it wasn't really hard for me because that was an album I had kind of grown up on. It was LCD Soundsystem had soundtracked the tail end of my high school years in suburbia, and then This Is Happening came out when I was a freshman in college. So I started to just kind of think broadly about what that band symbolized to me and what I thought were sort of things that were not just applicable to my life, but things that I had observed in my friends or generationally, and decided to. It wasn't really a decision. I just kind of came up with various themes that I thought were going on in the music world or in American culture that this band was somehow tapping into or reflective of. And that's why it kind of took on the format of these kind of series of essays that, one dealing with nostalgia or retro culture or whatever. So it's not, I guess, maybe it's cheating to say it's an entire book about LCD exclusively. But, I was kind of looking at LCD and thinking, this is a band that, to me, sums up a pretty large slice of, American experience through the years they were active. And so kind of spooled out from there.
Okay. And you were turned on to it by Kruger. He said your art teacher in high school. You called him the arbiter of good music.
Yeah. I actually don't think he has the book yet, so I don't know if he knows about that. But when I was in high school, I was more of a visual artist, and the studio was sort of our little fiefdom within the campus, and stay after school and work into the night, or would go there during my free bells and work, or free periods. That might have been a term specific to my high school, but
no, we have free periods.
There was always cool music playing. He was the guy who got me into a lot of things. Like a lot of 80s alternative stuff. He was from the Midwest, from the college rock kind of era. So he grew up with Husker Du and the Replacements, and R.E.M. was one of his main bands. He had remained kind of hungry and interested in the indie world or alternative music or whatever. And around the time I was in high school, that meant he had My Morning Jacket's Z on all the time. We had Spiritualized on all the time, which really freaked people out when they would be coming through the studio to give a tour to prospective students, and the noise jam from Cop Shoot Cop would be on or something. At some point, I think my high school girlfriend played North American Scum for me, and I went back into the studio the next day and asked to hear that album, and queued it up, and Get Innocuous was he had this kind of old sort of resurrected speaker system that he had. It was kind of a Frankenstein thing he had put together from various yard sales. And he's like a big audiophile, so there's this really crazy speaker system in this room that was also full of all this weird junk he had found, like mounted deer heads next to lamps from the 60s, and all this stuff that was there for us to draw or whatever. But it was just a really weird room, and that's the first concrete, tangible memory I have of hearing the album the whole way through. And I think, as I said in the book, I had a very different idea of what that band would have looked like or acted like at the time relative to what they turned out to be. I pictured one of those early aughts rock revival kind of bands with the awkwardly gelled hair and the super skinny ties. Somebody who would have followed in the wake of the Strokes. Yeah. And then I saw LCD Soundsystem and it was like, who are these guys? And it only made them more interesting from there, though. And when you find out more about James's story and how long it took him to get to that point, all that kind of stuff.
Did the album hit you immediately when you heard it?
From what I remember, because I was having a big Talking Heads phase. Okay, that was probably when I was about, I guess I would have been about 17 or 18, and I think I would have gotten into the Talking Heads a little earlier than that, but I think I was just maybe digging deeper at that point. And I remember listening to Speaking in Tongues and Remain in Light quite a bit around that time. So in that context, Get Innocuous came on, and I heard it as an echo of that. I heard it as more David Byrne than David Bowie at the time. Now I think of that vocal part as kind of David Bowie-esque, but this is also around the time that I think I came into Sound of Silver a little bit late. I think by the time I would have been listening to it, Dear Science by TV on the Radio would have been out.
Okay.
So that was another album where I was like hearing all these Talking Heads influences. So I remember playing that stuff together quite a bit.
What was it, 2006?
I think Dear Science was 08 and Sound of Silver would have been 07.
Okay.
And I think Cookie Mountain was 06, I think. But yeah, so I mean, I remember, Get Innocuous is kind of one of those moments where like, the thing I always kind of go back to when I hear an album like that is there's this Bruce Springsteen quote where he talks about the snare drum at the beginning of Like a Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
And how that's kind of the sound of the door inside your head getting kicked open. And I really like albums that have openers that function that way and, sort of immediately show you this world you were kind of looking for without knowing you were. And that's the way Get Innocuous was.
Okay.
And, there were probably some other songs. I think there's still, I don't think it's a perfect record. I think there are still some songs like, Time to Get Away and Watch the Tapes are a little more like functional album cut type kind of things to me. But, the first time you hear someone great, it's like, especially like coming from my background, like at the time, I was not really into much electronic oriented music. So like someone great was sort of like totally otherworldly. And then all my friends, that was, I think then, and it's only increased for me personally, but I think also in general cultural stature since, like, I think that's like one of the songs of my generation or the era or however you want to say it. So, from what I can remember from 10 years ago, I mean, I was driving around listening to that album kind of constantly, and, it was also a little bit, it felt kind of exotic or foreign because, grew up in a semi-rural small town, close to cities, but not that close to cities.
Okay.
So I think there was something else about it, even maybe before I intellectualized what it all kind of seemed to mean or whatever. It's just kind of like that was the sound of New York, on the distant horizon.
Does it get kind of feel special too? Because like not everyone is listening to it where you live.
Yeah, that was. I mean, it's funny because
like it's yours.
This was the era of poptimism and the internet. I think I think it very much changed how we listen, what we listen. You can listen to anything you want at any time. And the funny thing is, like, I now think of at least the last 10 years of my life as being this era in which, like, what is the point of any sort of pop music tribalism? Like, and James Murphy actually talked about that at some point. Growing up in Jersey, he didn't know that you weren't supposed to listen to the Minutemen as well as, I don't remember the exact band. He said like the Human League or something like that. But that was the case. I was talking with Bob Mould actually about this earlier or at the end of last year, and people went to Husker Du shows, like you weren't talking about Soft Cell or you weren't talking about Duran Duran, whatever. And there was a little bit of that still going on when I was in high school in Pennsylvania. Perhaps that might have been Kruger's influence too, since he was like an old school college rock guy. But there was this feeling of like I said, like the art room was kind of our little fiefdom. And, you could kind of rest assured that most people on campus weren't listening to LCD Soundsystem or that was before the National blew up. Like that was even like a sort of it felt like our secret, like whatever circle of people. And I mean, that kind of, I think that's a good kind of question mark with LCD Soundsystem in general, even now, is that they feel like a band of magnitude because us people in the media who, you know, create the narrative, write about them a lot and make them seem that way. Then they come back or because they anointed themselves that way with a, you know, goodbye film.
Yeah.
And then they come back and they headline festivals and all this kind of stuff. But, you know, I don't really know what their reach is when you go to a town like where I grew up, or, you know, when you're more out in America. And it seems to have grown today, you know, post reunion. It definitely seems like it's greater than back in 07 or 08 when I was back home. I mean, it was definitely like a circle of 15 or 20 people I knew who were talking about Sound of Silver. But I would go online on Pitchfork or Stereogum or whatever, and then I would see that it was like a big, you know, part of the conversation. It's just that on the ground level where I was,
not that many people.
You couldn't go into a store and buy the album, you know?
Yeah.
They didn't cover that. They didn't carry that kind of stuff.
Why do you think it was that from the beginning that they were the critics' darlings?
I think part of it is that Murphy is like a writer, you know. This is the oft repeated thing, but, you know, he turned down that job on Seinfeld and this and that, and I think he's the kind of guy that later on could probably write criticism or fiction and be really good at it, be really funny. So, you know, I think you have the attitude he has, I think, kind of connects with critics. He's also just a complete music geek, you know? I mean, like if you're talking about a mid-aughts kind of ethos, he's like a walking version of one of those MP3 blogs. But even like, you know, he was bringing all this stuff to the fore that at the time, you know, sort of taken for granted now, but like, you know, there's an anecdote he tells in some interview where he talks about how he and Tim Goldsworthy originally bonded over the fact that like it was so unhip to like the Smiths in the late 90s. And, you know, there's also that Chuck Klosterman essay from the early aughts where, and it kind of walks a questionable line, but he goes to a convention in LA where it's all like Mexicans in Los Angeles who are still listening to Morrissey and love Morrissey and come dressed up for the Morrissey convention, all this kind of stuff. And he's kind of musing, you know, about like, you know, where did this guy's original fan base go? And around that time, like, yeah, like the Smiths were not like canonized in the way they became soon after with the early aughts rock revival or indie or whatever. So you hear about these DJ sets he was doing where he was bringing in disco, which was certainly not yet critically revived, particularly in the indie world, krautrock, like all these different things that, you know, have since become like sort of perennial touching points. So I think that's partly, you know, why he would have caught on is, you know, just kind of the amount he consumed and then filtered.
Okay.
And, you know, it functions similarly to, you know, how critics once functioned, you know, like being the gatekeepers, being the tastemakers. I think that function, it feels more irrelevant to me in music media these days, given that everybody has access to everything. But, and also I think just his whole story and the way he writes about it and what he writes, you know, like, I think there's a really canny way he writes about sort of time passing by and you know, like sort of the experiences you've accrued or not accrued and, you know, figuring out what you're going to do with yourself, which a not insignificant factor there is probably the fact that the media is mostly located in New York. Yeah, so there's a lot of listless 20 or early 30-somethings, you know, figuring out like themselves still, or like, you know, are they going to still doing this? You know, just like in that context, I think, you know, James sort of, it resonates, you know.
Have you had a chance to meet him or talk to him?
I actually haven't.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Even still, so because the book kind of came about last minute, it coincided with when they were rehearsing for all these festival headlining dates this year. So I didn't have any access to the band then. And I've been in a few situations since where I probably could have gone backstage and said hello to him. But, like, I don't know. I haven't pushed the matter. I would like to, you know, when the time comes, when that next album is imminent, I'd like to profile them. Actually, for a long time, for probably half the time that they were retired, I had been wanting to do a piece about, James Murphy and self-chosen exile, kind of, which now obviously I've missed the boat on that. There were pieces like that, but I wanted to do kind of an expansive one. But yeah, never met him. I've actually never met any of the members of LCD Soundsystem still. Yeah. So maybe someday.
Yeah. And so you said you were thinking of being a visual artist, so that was your thing.
Yeah. I mean, I was always a writer too.
Okay. So
I mean, as far as I can remember, when I was a kid, I think, it was basically like, thought of myself, I think I wanted to be like an author or a comic book artist or a filmmaker. Because those were the things I liked when I was a kid. I used to read a lot. Eventually started drawing comic kind of stuff, so I started reading a lot of comics, and then that led to more of a actual visual art training. So there was a brief flirtation with going to art school, but in hindsight, I kind of feel as if I was technically proficient with visual art, but I don't know if that I had the conceptual thing. I was also a teenager, but I think I had that more locked down with writing. And so I wound up instead going to a weird program at NYU that sort of was a bit of a choose-your-own-adventure approach to college, and it allowed me to just do a ton of writing. And I studied abroad in Shanghai, and that kind of was the turning point where I wound up working on a lot of fiction and journalism while there, and came back and started interning at magazines. So just kind of, I just kind of kept on opening the doors that were in front of me, kind of a thing. And, however many years later, it's went in the writing direction instead of the visual art or the musician direction. But,
was it always a music focus?
Mostly. I mean, I grew up playing music and was a more active musician when I was younger, and it's my primary obsession. I mean, I sort of have more of a hunger for pop culture than the hours of the day allow to, satiate. But so yeah, I guess in college, I started doing some music journalism stuff then. I was also doing more fiction and more kind of, I don't really know how to, nonfiction stuff that wasn't really like memoir or personal essay, but they were stories that, they were things that had happened in my life, but I wasn't really always a character. It was just kind of like, telling a story that happened to be real, but like it could have read like a short story or something. And that's all stuff that, I'd kind of, when I first started freelancing after college, I was doing a lot more film and TV stuff mixed in with the music stuff, but the music stuff, I could speak to it most immediately. That's where the opportunities were, and just kind of, particularly as my relationship with Stereo Gum grew, it just kind of became sort of all consuming from a schedule standpoint. And but that's the idea is always that I'd like to, if I'm going to be just doing criticism and journalism, I would like to be going back and doing more film and television writing. And the broader idea is that I kind of want to get back to doing more kind of creative nonfiction or just creative writing generally. But in terms of pitch a piece and know you'll get paid for it, that's mostly music stuff. Yeah.
Or do you find yourself there's themes that you keep writing about, regardless of the subject? Yeah.
I mean, it depends. I mean, I don't try to shoehorn it in everywhere, but they're
or organically.
Yeah, I mean, some of them crept into the LCD book, and some of them are rooted in some of those kind of essays I have sitting around. I used to work in a drug and alcohol rehab in the summers during college, and between that and some of the places I went during college, and sort of this liminal phase I had after college where I was sort of spending time in Las Vegas, my hometown, in New York equally.
Your hometown's outside of Scranton.
Yeah, it's where The Office takes place. So, and that's a pretty accurate depiction of the vibe there. So between all that, I kind of, I grew up, reading stuff like my godfather was a big Jack Kerouac fan, and I grew up with a large extended family in New Jersey. So between all those factors, Kerouac and Springsteen were sort of these artistic pillars.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, and then some of the experiences I had kind of in the last, 7 to 10 years or so, I kind of got interested in, how we use place in America to define our identity, but, sort of parsing that in the 21st century, in the digital era. And, I kind of feel as if there's this kind of, for all the massive benefits of the digital era, I think there's all these kind of social implications that aren't negatives necessarily, just things that we're still not even really like scratching the surface of understanding because it happens so quickly. And I feel like there's this like kind of weird disassociation that occurs in like 21st century America, which is also partially, I think, it being a sort of post 9/11, post American century kind of era. So I go back to all these like kind of 20th century, great American works by, Fitzgerald or Hemingway or whatever, and initially Mad Men, I think also kind of slots in with that kind of stuff. And, something that interests me is sort of, how we're now living with all that kind of mythology in an ever-present way, and, how it feels depleted or hollow or still resonant. And, there's a whole strain of it in which people can feel nostalgia. I think nostalgia is a very major part of, the times, so to speak. Digging into all that kind of stuff is interesting to me, and sometimes that creeps into the music criticism I do, and sometimes even like if I'm profiling an artist, did a profile on the war on drugs about 2.5 years ago. That to me, that album they put out, Lost in the Dream, was something that was tonally coming out of what I was thinking about. I guess it doesn't hurt they're Philly artists, so the landscape was familiar. Sometimes it creeps into that kind of stuff, but I try to save the real deep engagement with that for some of the more creative stuff that I haven't really published yet.
Okay. And how does your home like define you? Or is it one of the defining places?
Yeah. I think, many people who live in New York are sort of, obviously there are people who are from here, but, I think a lot of people who live here, it's sort of you're equally defined by what you left. And then, if you've been here for some amount of years, like I have, or like you have, like you have that side of your personality, that version of yourself. And I don't know about when you go back to Pittsburgh, but when I go back home, it's weird. I'll like give it 2 days and I'll start to feel myself, there's recurrences of this kind of older version that I don't recognize anymore.
That I
thought I had sort of left behind at the bus stop.
Like, no, there he is.
Yeah, it's like, no, he's still there. I think, for me, it's like there's a little bit of, and this is a little probably over dramatic, or just like wanting to narrativize my own life or something, but there's a little bit of like,
this is going to help with an essay one day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I could write about this, but there's a little bit, I kind of sometimes would describe it like, I grew up in a town that was not quite as, hard or depleted as a town on one of those 1970s or early 80s Springsteen records, but not too far off either. It's a formerly prosperous area that never really recovered from the, end of the railroad and the, the decline of the coal industry in the area. So, it's kind of one of those areas that many of us, I don't want to say everybody, but many young people, you kind of spend a long stretch of your young life planning to leave.
Okay,
so, once you get to that other place, you're sort of defining yourself in opposition to where you came from. Like, I got out and this and that, and I don't want to get sucked back in and, all that kind of stuff. That being said, I think there's also a positive to it because I think it kind of grounds me in a way too because, it's a little easy to... New York can be a very myopic existence, just thinking that the whole rest of the country thinks and acts like the way people do here. And, when you're traveling around with bands around the country or in Europe, you see all these other elements of the world, but it's sort of helpful to every now and then, that was actually like, I had a moment watching Strand of Oaks in Barcelona last year at Primavera Festival. And a lot of people don't know this, but Tim Showalter is not an Indiana transplant who wound up right in Philly. He actually spent about 8 years in my hometown. Knows all the same people. He taught a bunch of the kids that I went to school with at a different school. He, played at the DIY venues that my friends used to play at. And a lot of his songs are actually about Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding areas, not about Philly. So he was playing this particular song called Sterling, which was named after an old hotel in Wilkes-Barre that has since been torn down. But, it was one of those remnants from the glorious 1920s days in these towns. And, presidents had stayed there and this and that. And it's a real... On the album, it's one of his more acoustic albums, but live... in that version of Strand of Oaks, that iteration of the band, he had turned it into this kind of lurching, mid-tempo, kind of crazy horse type thing. Yeah. But it was also like this sort of unspooling, like almost psychedelic narrative of, him being in the hotel and imagining he's with the Kennedys, and he went to like the Boscov store and he cites a particular exit on the highway around there. And he's saying all this, and like the water is off to our left, and we're in Barcelona on the last night of Primavera, and I'm just kind of like, neither of us should have made it here. How did this happen? I couldn't have imagined the steps to take to go from being in that art room in Wilkes-Barre to, being in New York or traveling around Europe with bands or, all that kind of stuff. So, there's the positive way in which my hometown would still kind of factor not into my personality, or at least I'd like to think, is that, it keeps me a little grateful and humble about, the fact that, well, I did get out. Now I do get to go to Reykjavik and Helsinki and all these other stupid things I get to do for my job for some reason.
Was there like a special drive in you, or somebody encouraged you?
I don't know. I mean, that's hard to say. To be honest, like, school kind of came pretty easy to me. And I worked hard, but I don't know that I had a whole lot of, there wasn't, I never had like a 5-year plan. I was never like, all right, I got to get to New York so I can get this internship freshman year and then, build from there. Like, I had no clue. Like, I was between Boston University and New York University, and the only reason I chose NYU because it was New York. And like, I had, the artists I liked were from New York, and I'd grown up watching Seinfeld with my father. And it was just like, that's the place you go, and like, that's the city, that's it. And, I wound up capitalizing on that. It took me a little while. Like, first 2 years at NYU, I feel like I didn't really engage with the city enough. It was really, the turning point was kind of when I went away to China for a semester, and then when I got back. And after that, then things were a little more like, in fact, I felt like I was behind because I was a little old for my grade. I was, born in 90, and, all the other kids were always like almost a year younger than me. Or not all the kids, but, I knew kids who were my year or the year younger who were like already freelancing and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, holy shit, like I gotta get this together. And I started interning at magazines and trying to pitch a lot, freelance stuff. So around that time, that's I became kind of serious about, and like had all these machinations, like all right, I want to have a book out by this age, a book out that by that age. And it's funny, actually, I told a professor, mentor type figure of mine who's since remained a friend since the NYU days. I remember telling her shortly after I graduated that I wanted to have a book out by 26. He's like, well, that's ambitious, but and I remember sitting in, I was back home in Pennsylvania, sitting in, my childhood room, going through some papers, and remembering that as I was 9 months from turning 26, and realizing like, I kind of dropped the ball there. And then the 33 and a third offer came through a week later, so it was kind of another ironic twist. Not, it's a tiny book, but
a book is a book.
Still have a book by 26, so. That was another kind of nice element to the surprise there. But
so you're in NYU, and when does like a big break come through? Like, this is real, the journalism.
I think the first thing was, so when I got back from China, I had wound up just kind of blindly applying to an internship at GQ, and I remember, I think I sent the email from Shanghai, got on a 10.5-hour flight, landed in Sydney, and they wanted to bring me in for an interview. And I was like, well, I'm in Australia, but I could come in after Christmas. And so I met with these two editors, and they brought me back in, and I met with Michael Haney, who was the deputy editor at the time. He's now at Esquire. But and Michael was like, he was just this kind of fascinating character to me. He just kind of seemed like this magazine world guy that I didn't know whether that had still existed, but that like, in my mind at the time, that's what I wanted. Like I wanted to do like literary magazine kind of work. So he interviewed me and offered me the internship later that night. And that to me was kind of mind blowing and surreal because I had no media experience whatsoever, and really had very little traditional work experience. Like insofar as had office jobs, like I'd worked in that drug and alcohol rehab. Yeah. I had like, a work study job at the NYU Law School. I think that's it. Okay. I mean, I might be forgetting something kind of minor, but
have they seen samples of your writing?
Yeah, but I mean, it was like, I don't know, lame album review stuff I'd done like as a sophomore in college or something. So yeah, that was, and that was like a real, like, holy shit. Yeah. Like, I mean, to be in
GQ.
to be going to the Condé, like, they were still in the Condé Nast building at the time. So like to be going to that building for an internship, twice a week and, see all that, and just hear people on the phone with these major celebrities. It was kind of like, how did I fall ass backwards into this world? And then, from there I did an internship at Rolling Stone, and during that time got a few of my first like freelance bylines. I wrote a little bit for GQ website at the time. At the time, Sean Fennessy was editing it, and he actually left for Grantland during the time I was there. So he was doing a kind of Grantland style thing on GQ's site at the time, and so I'd gotten to do some stuff for them. But then, like, the first time I managed to sort of pitch a new editor who hadn't met me in person, who hadn't been, my internship supervisor. That started senior. That kind of felt like a step. But in hindsight, the stuff that really kind of marked the turning point was when my then classmate, now coworker, Gabriella June Tully Claymore, put me in touch with Stereo Gum, and I did my first thing for them April of my senior year, and then by September of that year, I want to say, I was in Las Vegas, and my editor Michael Nelson called me and said they wanted to start doing artist features and that they wanted me to take a lead on it, and that kind of became the anchor of my journalistic experience for the next, I don't know, what's it been, 3 years?
Okay.
two and a half years? Yeah, that would have been late 13. Late 13, not late 14.
Okay.
So yeah.
What was like your first feature?
The Walkman.
Okay.
Which was around the time that they were going on indefinite hiatus or whatever you want to call it. It kind of varies depending on who you talk to.
Okay.
But yeah, that was the first big one we did, and I think the War on Drugs was the next one, if I remember correctly. And then there's been things of varying sizes and scope and all that kind of stuff since. And as that snowballed, it led to a lot of travel opportunities. So the turning point was, and I guess that feature thing led to me moving back to New York, which is also when like this kind of got like solidified as the thing I'm going to do for the time being, at least.
What is your like preparation for interviews?
It varies. Features? I mean, some artists I kind of already know in and out, and I prefer to do it more conversationally. So I don't like doing phoners if I can avoid it. I like doing them in person if it's possible.
Same here.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, it's nice to just like, beyond sometimes if you're a fan of the person, I just prefer to meet people as opposed to having a phone call. It's, I don't know, it's a little strained, I feel like, doing that kind of thing on when you have 20 minutes on the phone and, then a PR person is going to jump in and cut you off mid-question. So yeah, there's certain people where, I already know, I might know them already, or I already know, their career and can kind of sit down and, like that. This interview never ran actually, but I interviewed Guy Garvey from Elbow, and that was a band that I had been really obsessed with in high school. So I asked him like all these like really nerdy questions that he would, he was like, how do you know about that? And, but otherwise we're just talking about the new album. And there are always these kind of basic questions you can ask, like, tell me about the album title and they might say something there that, surprises you, that opens up, some other avenue you haven't been thinking about. So yeah, I have like a sort of, handful of like reliable go-to questions that everybody can kind of answer, and hopefully they'll answer it in kind of interesting way. But, if it's somebody I don't know that well, like I'll read up on them, listen to the music a lot while I'm doing so. Try to figure out, it's also ideal to kind of try and figure out something interesting to do with them. So it's like I prefer to get to know a person as opposed to sit down and ask them, like, so where'd you record the album? And, like, what is this song about? Like, it's better when you're like doing something and like get to write a character sketch, I feel.
Got it. And so with the book out, what would have been your first book if that didn't just come around?
That's a good question because I'm trying to figure out what this project is now. I mean, like for a while, kind of like I mentioned earlier, like I had been kind of plotting to pitch a 33 1/3. So that was always something that was in the back of my mind, is like try to do that, and that's a helpful step towards getting a full length if it works out right. Yeah, I don't know. Now I'm kind of toying with all these different loose ends I've got sitting around. I kind of want to get back to working on fiction a little more seriously right now. But nonfiction wise, like I had some inclination to kind of, I wrote some things that found a home when I was younger, but not ideal homes, because it was just like the editors I could get access to when I was 22 and right out of college. But so I always kind of had this hope to sort of, and some of it's like stuff that I'm still really proud of, that like I'd kind of like to put together in some different form, and I think there's a lot of like linked thematic stuff between a lot of that earlier stuff I was doing, and so I always thought maybe like trying to collect all that, but maybe make it more narrative, like kind of put in all these stories from things I've done around America, being on the road or something. I also started to come up with a lot of essay ideas that sort of related to my hometown, and I started to kind of toy with the idea of trying to do something not pop culture related whatsoever, and sort of have these series of stories that partially about the hometown and the idea of home or whatever, but then tied in with all this other kind of travel writing kind of stuff. But the idea would be to hopefully not veer too closely to anything like memoir or I feel like that's not like the direction I'd want to go with that. It's kind of like I just sort of want to come up with a way to tell these stories that feels some kind of thematically resonant. And I might be a character in some of them, or I might not be, but I don't. I kind of want to write about a variety of these experiences I've collected over the course of the last few years without it being like a little like navel gazing, like here's a 26-year-old who drove around the country a few times, or some bullshit like that.
Yeah. Have you written about the drug and alcohol when you worked there?
A little bit. One of the essays I have from home is actually about a particular summer, the first summer after college when I was working there, and that was the summer I started interviewing the patients.
Okay.
That was my role, was to sort of it was part of like the intake process. So like once they'd already been checked in and all the medical stuff, usually while they were still within their detox phase earlier in their time there, I would interview them, and I'd kind of have to collect like their life story, and it could be sort of harrowing, people had really crazy dark stories, and you're just sort of sometimes having people really struggling at this point in their life, telling you these stories, and you would hear like 10 a day, and you just leave at the end of the day like, Jesus Christ.
And you're catching people like at one of the worst
times of their lives. They're going to be doing a lot better in 2.5 weeks, hopefully. So like you're catching them at a particularly bad moment at a particularly bad crossroads in their life that if all goes well, goes in a hopeful direction afterwards, but at that moment, it's pretty bleak, or it can be. But and that just kind of coincided with some things that were going on in some of my friends' lives, and it was a very strange year, I think, for all of us, kind of first adjusting to living in big mythic New York City, and then returning to small dilapidated Wilkes-Barre. So I have that. I have some writing from that period of time sitting around from a few years ago, and I think I have a feeling that addiction and alcoholism and some of the themes related to those, like, I think they'll crop up in some of the other stuff I want to do, because it's something that beyond having worked there, I grew up around that, within that culture. A lot of my people in my family are very involved in AA or Al-Anon. So,
did you avoid that?
Going to rehab? Yeah. So far, so good. No, I didn't. I just worked in rehab. I didn't go.
Is that one of the reasons for working there?
Yeah. Some of my family members work there. So it was a much more interesting summer job than going home and working at an ice cream shop or something. It gave me and that was actually, to be honest, I think that's part of the reason I got the GQ internship. I think in the first interview, they're like, "Why'd you go to China?" And like it seemed to be, this kid just got back from Shanghai, he worked in a drug and alcohol rehab. Like, what is his deal? And that seemed to be the thing that in my second round of interviews, they were like, what did you learn working in rehab? And it was something that gave me a lot more life experience, a lot more things to think about than like otherwise. My other job at home back in the day was working at a guitar shop. So, like selling comic books and putting on whatever new indie albums were out in 2008. So
what did you learn?
Oh man, now we're digging a little further back. I don't remember the answer I gave him, actually.
Well, now,
now it's weird for me to think about now, because it's weird. and the way I grew up is certainly a factor here too, but like it still impacts so much of how I perceive things. And now I spend a lot of time in the music industry. So, you know, I've been around some characters and some scenarios where, you know, it's weird to kind of think back to that world and then move into this world and you know, wonder, you know, like, is this person in trouble or am I just, you know, hyper conscious and you know, like, you know, all that kind of stuff. But it was one kind of like weird thought. You know, I remember one line of thinking I had around that time, and this was directly kind of in opposition to, you know, kind of the summer that I saw going on with my friends that year. This was like 2010, I think. There was something like, I obviously did not envy people with addiction or people who were in rehab, but there was this movement there that, you know, I was this sort of like forward momentum, this, you know, this assertion that seemed so like that was easy to kind of be enviable of because everything around us otherwise seemed so listless. Like we all were like going to college and all this, but like it seemed like there was no movement or forward direction, that, you know, various friends were mired in some phase or another. And, you know, I would go to this weird day job otherwise and, you know, kind of see these people who were acting so much more directly than I felt like I could. And that created a really weird dynamic as I was sort of floating or drifting around my hometown in, you know, circles for the 3.5 months I was there in between, you know, school years or whatever.
Okay. And just sort of like closing up the LCD reunion. Are you scared of a reunion when you love a group so much?
I go back and forth on that. With them, I was at like
everything.
I was at everything. I was at the last show when I was still a student and wasn't a music journalist, and you know, at the time that was like, you know, not to like sound like an asshole, but I've been to a few of those kinds of things since you gather those kinds of experiences the more you know work in this side of it. But at the time, that was like one of the only things like that I'd been to, and it was just like monumental and like, you know, and it was also, I was very close to never having been able to see them. Like I saw the last 2 LCD shows, and this was after like I had passed on the opportunity to see them like on my preceding birthday, because I'll have plenty of opportunities, and then like, and I was out of town for another, you know, whatever it was. So, you know, like when the reunion was announced, there were a lot of fans who were sort of like, that was this special experience, and like it's all undone. And like my perspective is like, I still have that experience. I still remember how I felt on that night and on, you know, in the subsequent years. But now I get to have the experience of, you know, the return, which is like, I mean, the goodbye show was amazing and emotional, all that kind of stuff, but I feel like these reunion shows just have a whole different level of power now. I mean, like the band sounds incredible, and you know, some of these songs I think have only, like I was saying earlier, like have only grown in stature. Like I feel like all my friends now, when they, I've seen them close, I don't know, 3 or 4 festivals with that this past summer. And it's unreal. Like, it's just like hearing thousands of people like scream along to that song. And it's just like, you know, one of those sort of, you know, it can be trite or cliche or whatever, but it's one of those times where you realize why the cliches develop, because like, you know, it's a transformative, you know, communal concert experience. But beyond, you know, even, you know, aside from, it's like great to have them back and they sound great and all that kind of stuff. Like, I think his logic, I get where people are coming from, you know, being cynical about like this huge fanfare that was surrounding like what was essentially at the time a mid-level indie. I mean, not mid-level, like from a critical standpoint, they were like one of the indie bands, but from a cultural landscape standpoint, they weren't, you know, Arcade Fire or something. I don't know, but or the Strokes or whatever. So there's a lot of fanfare surrounding that goodbye, and I understand people who were like kind of turned off by them to begin with, who are also now like, give me a break. like 5 years later already, we're but I think. I would like to think, like James's reasoning that he's given, online, like it made sense. If he was making music, he was going to make it with these people. It's like, let's just call it what it is. Let's not be coy about this. Yeah. Let's bring back the old great songs everybody likes, as well as whatever new material we're working on. I think, I would like to think that this was not a crass ploy for that reunion money 5 years down the line, or that reunion boost in reputation 5 years down the line. If you watch the movie, like I think the day after he was kind of like, oh man, like what have I done? And I think it probably would have been better if they'd just done a hiatus or whatever, but and like everybody reunites these days, aside from like the Talking Heads and the Smiths, but everybody was kind of like, that's one of the bands, like they're not going to do it. And, so I don't know. It would have been interesting. Would have been cool if it was like this finite thing, like a truly finite thing in an era where we don't have a lot of those kinds of works, like bodies of work or whatever. If it had been this kind of like aughts, definitive thing. But I also think, this is a guy who I think probably still has more to say, and I think probably still has more good music in him. And I'm not going to lament him coming back and giving that a go, as opposed to, that New Yorker article talking about him developing his own coffee. Like, I think that his like as a fan, as a critic, all these different things, like I'm excited that his energy is being directed more that way than opening the wine bar in Williamsburg or trying to soundtrack the New York subway system. And I think a big factor in that though is if they had just come back and done the Pulp thing, and Pulp's another band like I love dearly and wish, like Jarvis Cocker, I don't understand why that guy isn't producing more. He's brilliant. And Pulp came back and I got to see them, and that was great, and the shows were great, but that's all they did. They came back and they did, tour for what was it, a year or two.
They didn't do an album.
No, all they did was put out that single, After You, which ironically was produced by James Murphy. But that song dated back to, before Pulp split. There's like a leftover demo. And so if LC Soundsystem had gone away the way they did and then come back and did something like that, that would have been really disappointing. Yeah. But the idea that they came out of the gates and they were kind of like, this is all because that there was this drive for new music. And we'll see what happens when/if that album comes out, and, how the album is. Like, it's going to have to be, like, pretty much a masterpiece to deliver on everybody's expectations. But, I think so far his track record's really good. So
it could happen.
Yeah, I'm mostly hopeful for this phase of whatever it is.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And best place people to keep up with you online?
Well, I guess sort of Twitter. I don't use it that. I mean, I share a lot of like articles on there, but I don't use it as much as I used to, given my sort of constant transience. I'm publishing stuff on Stereogum all the time too. So
just Google you.
Yeah, Stereogum on Twitter, I guess.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. This was great.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And there you have it, my conversation with Ryan Leas here on Talk Music Talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I did. Don't forget, follow him on Twitter at Ryan Leas, Leas, and I will put a link in the show notes to his Stereogum articles so you can read those. As for me, I am online several places, several ways. talkmusictalk.com for podcast information. My personal website, thisisboice.com, to read excerpts from the novels that I've written and check out my music. And if you are on Twitter or Instagram, follow me there at thisisboice. Don't forget the call to action. Share this episode on social media if you enjoyed it. Take the survey at talkmusictalk.com/survey and download the app wherever you get your apps. It's free for iPhone and Android, or you can subscribe on Google Play or iTunes. Just leave a rating and or review in the store. Excellent reason to download or to subscribe. 108, episode 108. With LCD Soundsystem's Gavin Russum. It is out now. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time, and there will be a next time. This one's for you, Liz.